Hello and welcome to my September reading wrap-up. I only read 9 books in September. I have a rather small stack here. So this is definitely one of my lower reading months in a minute. August was kind of a bad month for me reading-wise, so I took it easy in September. A reread, a lot of YA, you know, a couple audiobooks. I also haven't written Goodreads reviews for any of these, so I have literally no notes. I'm just going off of my memory, which may or may not wind up being great, but it is what it is. We'll figure it out. The first book that I finished in September was Long May She Reign by Emerson White. I actually reread the first 3 books in this series at the end of August. This is the 4th book in the President's Daughter series about a young girl who is the daughter of the first female president of the United States, and this covers kind of her life growing up under that, with like all of the press and the media attention and the difficulties that come with that. I give this 5 stars. This is perhaps my favorite book of all time. I absolutely adore this, like beyond reason. The first book is pretty, like, I'm not gonna say lighthearted, but it's more like normal angst. Like, her mother is running for president and she's like, this is really weird and I don't think I really like it. And then as the book goes on, there are like assassination attempts, she's kidnapped by terrorists, and then this book takes place her first year of college when she moves away from home for the first time, and she's dealing with all of this PTSD from being kidnapped by terrorists, and she's dealing with her new physical disabilities and all of the media attention that comes from, you know, she was kidnapped, she was gone for 2 weeks, and people are very, very interested in what she's doing, and she's just dealing with a lot in this book. And it's like 700 pages of her just living her life, and it's so interesting and so well done. Like, I love everything about this book. Like, everything about it is just so perfect. As I was reading it, it was literally like every page there was something I remembered that was like super distinct, like either like a line of dialogue or a scene or a moment or a quote or an idea that I was just like, I remember this, you know, like this really stands out to me. This is so well done. Like, this moment is like iconic, this moment is wonderful. And it's like every single page there was something like that in this 700-page book, and it was just so good. Like, I love the relationships that she has with her family, because so much of this is about family, because she's dealing with all this media scrutiny that like she can't really open up to outsiders very much, so family is very, very important to her. And she's dealing with her complicated relationship with her mother, the president, who is, you know, in kind of indirect ways sort of the cause of a lot of her trauma. And she's dealing with blaming her father for this as well, and struggling to cope with her new relationships with her brothers, who are now looking at her as like someone who almost died and like also contributed to this trauma in their lives. And it's just like all so perfect. And she's also just dealing with being a college freshman, which is difficult enough on its own. It's so perfect. Like, I don't know, everything about this book is fantastically done, and rereading it made me so happy. Like, I do just need to reread these books more often, because I really remembered like why I love this so much. And I always worry that I'm gonna overhype these books when I talk about them, but like then I read them and I'm like, no, they just really are that wonderful. So highly recommend. This was absolutely amazing. Then I read Indelible by Karin, which is the 4th book in the Grant County series, which I have been slowly reading this summer. I've been averaging like 1 a month. I gave this one 3 stars. This is about Dr. Sara, who is the coroner for Grant County, and her ex-husband, who is the chief of police, and them rekindling their relationship at the same time they solve horrific crimes in this small town. I gave this book 3 stars. Not my favorite. I really loved the first 2 books in this series, and then 3 and 4 were a little bit, pardon the cat hair that just floated down. 3 and 4 were a little bit less interesting to me, less good. Like, they're not bad by any means. I think this was very well written. I think it was very interesting, but it was very much a 3-star read. Basically, two mass shooters come into the police station and shoot everyone up, and kind of like a lot of people die and they're being held hostage, and it's kind of like, who are they? What is happening? And then that's half the story. And then the other half of the story is told like, I don't know, like 8 years in the past or something like that, as Jeffrey and Sara, before they got divorced, before they got married even, in the beginning of their relationship, took a visit to his hometown in Alabama and kind of dealt with his past there, and kind of how these two separate timelines come together. And like, I don't know, it's not my favorite way to tell a story. I think it often winds up just being a cheap way to keep the reader's interest when you don't have a singular narrative that's strong enough to carry the book. 'Cause I don't think either the past or the present timelines were enough to carry this novel forward. And there were a lot of times where it was like, you'd be in one of the timelines and things would build to a point and it would be like interesting, and you'd be reading a few chapters and then like it'd be like, oh my god, like a plot twist is about to come, and then you would cut away and, you know, go to the other timeline. It's like nothing is happening in that timeline. I would just like to follow the narrative of this one, and that's kind of a frustrating experience for me. It's just not a technique I like in thrillers. Like, it can work better for me in other types of books. It's just like in thrillers, it feels lazy. I don't like it. It just is kind of grating. I don't know. If you like that structure more than me, this is probably a much better book, because I do think the characters are still great. It's still well written. I just am not really a fan of the way she structured it, but it was still very enjoyable, very fun. Like, everything else about this was fine and interesting, and it did leave me like more excited to continue on. And it's like, I know I'm going to enjoy the next one more than I enjoyed this one. It was just, the structure is not really my thing. Then I listened to Pageboy by Elliot Page, which is his memoir, which I think I gave this 4 stars. Let me, this is what happens when I don't like have anything set up. I gave this 4 stars. Good audiobook. Positives, negatives. I really liked his voice and his narration. He has a really great audiobook voice, and just like, I don't know, it was well done. Like, I would love to listen to him narrate other things. He has a very sad voice. Like, the book itself was very sad because it's a lot about like the homophobia and transphobia he experienced, because like a lot of this book is about the homophobia and transphobia that he experienced. But like, his voice just made it so much sadder because he just sounds like downtrodden. And I don't think he was sad. I think it's just like, that's how his voice is. But it was a really pleasant narration. The book itself was really interesting. Jesus. I closed the door, so they're both going wild. I lost my train of thought. I'm not the biggest Elliot Page fan. Like, I've seen his movies, like, he's fine. But it's like, I wouldn't consider myself, like, a fan of him. Like, he's not someone who I would, like, go out of my way to watch their work. I like Hard Candy. I like the roller skating movie he did. I don't remember. But I'm not like a huge fan of his. I was just reading this book out of curiosity, and like, it was well done. Like, it was interesting to learn about his life. It was interesting to learn about like his roles in various movies and how he feels about them, and like his experience coming out in such a public way, you know, because like he lived his life in the spotlight from a very young age. Not so positives, negatives. I didn't really like how much time and focus was spent on his various celebrity relationships. I don't know, like, it was something about the way he wrote them, and then just my lack of interest in them in general, but was not the biggest fan of that. They weren't a huge part of the book, but they were big enough that like I just kind of found them boring, and I was a lot more interested in him than like his relationships. And it also jumped around a lot, which I do have much more of a problem with this when it comes to audiobooks. But like, he would be talking about something, like he'd be talking about doing Juno, and then he'd be talking about being like an 8-year-old living with his mother, and then he would jump forward and be talking about like something from like 5 years ago, like whatever, you know. And it was like very hard for me to keep up with where we were in the context of his life, and kind of like put all the events together in a way that worked. I wish it'd been like, maybe not like fully, like, I wish it'd just been a little more linear. Like, maybe not completely, but I did kind of struggle, because it seemed at times like a jumble of scenes, but I did really enjoy this. It was a really great listen, and I would highly recommend. And also, like, his title, 10 out of 10. He really just, like, went for it with the perfect title there, so you gotta give him credit for that. Then I read Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan, which is a romance novel, and I gave this 4 stars as well. Like I said, this was a much better month than August. So romance novel. I'd heard great things. I am not the biggest romance reader, but I try. I just struggle to find what I enjoy in romance, and I think I finally found it, and it is this book and books like this. So this is the story of 2 people who, after they got divorced, they were very happily married for a long time, had 2 kids, and then they had a pregnancy that ended in stillbirth, and that, you know, was a lot of grief for them and a lot of trauma, and that pushed them apart. They got divorced, and then this is kind of them rekindling their romance in some ways and growing, like, both as in a relationship and as individuals, and it was just really well done. Like, I think this book has gotten a lot of praise for, like, obvious reasons. It's just a really well done book that takes itself seriously and, like, spends time to, like, develop this trauma that they've experienced. I closed the door and they have both lost their minds. Like, it's like they think they have to eat each other because the door is closed. Anyway, it was really sad. It was really well done. The sadness was very well developed. Like, everything was earned in terms of the emotions, which I really liked. You know, like, I like when characters are sad and when they kind of, like, can use a relationship to kind of get through their grief, but it has to be earned. It has to be developed. It can't just be, like, slapped on there because it's a romance novel. And it was just really well written, like, a little bit overwritten for me, but I think that's just, like, romance novels in general. I did have a few issues with it. I didn't love her friends, mostly because I felt like the friends didn't fit very well within the story. Like, they were very interesting, had interesting lives, but they felt more of, like, setting up for books about them than they were just, like, existing within this singular story, which, I don't know, like, I would 100% read a book about one of her friends if she wrote one, but it just didn't work super well in this story. And then there were little things that just kind of seemed, like, glazed over a little too much. Like, the romantic lead, he is very against therapy from the beginning of this book. He's been against therapy for years, and the main character's been trying to get him to go to therapy, and then they're in a situation where their son is encouraged to go to therapy, and he decides to go, you know, to provide support for his son. It's like, if I go to therapy, then my son will feel good about going to therapy. So he does, and it's just, like, kind of a flick of a switch. Like, suddenly therapy is great and healing him, and it's like 5 minutes into his first session, and it was just like, there were a couple of things like that weren't, like, huge issues, but it was just, like, I think they needed to be, like, a little bit more fleshed out. But, like, this book was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend, if you're, like, not a big romance reader, but if you're trying to, like, dip your toe in a little bit. I do think I'm never going to be a huge romance reader, which I think this book kind of taught me, because even, like, with how well done this book was and how much I enjoyed it, there was, like, that little bit of, like, I wish the focus hadn't been on their romance so much and had been more on, like, the family, because I do think there was, like, a lot more there, and I think that's just me not being a romance reader, but it was good. It was great. Like, highly recommend. So, I don't know, that was a successful experiment, I guess, that I finally have found a romance book that I really, really love. And then I read the last 4 books in the Tomorrow series by John Marsden. I read the first 3 in July, I think, and then since I was finally, like, enjoying a few books, I was like, let's just get them done, because I'm not the biggest fan of the series. Like, I would give this whole series 3 stars. Book-wise, I'm trying to think. 4, 5, 6, 7. So the 4th one, Darkness Be My Friend, I would give 2 stars. This was maybe the worst book of the series. I should talk about the series as a whole first. Essentially, this is about a group of teenagers who go off camping. It's like summer or whatever. They go off camping for a few days, and when they come back, they find out that they've been invaded by a foreign country, and, like, their parents and family and neighbors are all being held in like this concentration camp, and they've just been invaded, and it's kind of them over the course of the next like year or two as they're committing acts of sabotage and like trying to track down family members and just like figure out what this new world is. So I read the first 3, fine for the most part, not my favorite, and then like I said, book 4 was pretty bad. Nothing happened. Like books 1 through 3 were kind of an arc. They kind of took you to another place. They start out camping in this area they call hell because it's really hard to get into, and then they kind of commit acts of sabotage, and like it kind of builds and builds and builds, and then at the end of the 3rd book everything takes a turn, and then this was right back to book 1, and it kind of started everything over, and yet nothing happened. It was a really odd book because it was just like nothing happened, and oh, it was kind of miserable to get through. It might have been the worst of the series for me. And then book 5, Burning for Revenge. They make a journey to a city because they've blown something else up again. They do a lot of blowing things up because I guess the author realized that that was about the only thing this group of untrained teenagers can do to help the war. Like, they don't have access to a lot of firepower, but they can blow up a car. You know, they can figure out how to do that. So that's what they do throughout this whole book. And they wind up going to a different area in this book. They go to a city that's been taken over. And it's kind of just like a change of venue. So yeah, that's what happened here. 3 stars, it was fine. Book 6, The Night is for Hunting. This was kind of an odd one because they don't blow anything up in this book, which I think was the first book that they didn't blow anything up in. A little bit odd. They meet this group of kids who they call like feral kids because, you know, when the war's been going on for a year and you meet a 6-year-old, that 6-year-old doesn't really remember anything pre-war. So this book is like this whole like weird side plot of them taking care of this group of kids and trying to like help them out. It was a fine fast read, but it was like the weirdest of the bunch because it wasn't really about the war at all. But it also introduced a lot of like interesting ideas that I wish he'd be explored more, because there were a lot of parallels between the group of kids and the group of teens, you know, because they are kids too, and it was just like, it could have been more interesting than it was, which I kind of feel that way about this whole series, but it was fine. It's fine. And then the 7th book, The Other Side of Dawn, is the epic conclusion. It's the longest by kind of a wide margin. Also my favorite of the series. Almost got 4 stars, gave it 3. It was fine. Like, it was exciting. It was like the best time that I had reading one of these books. I had a really good time reading it. It was fun. It was like action-packed. It was cool. It was like I wanted to keep reading. I wanted to find out more. And then the ending was kind of like slapped on there. Like it both lacked closure and also spent like 15 pages summing up where everyone is 2 years later. And I don't know, it wasn't the best ending, but the book itself was really fun. I really enjoyed this one overall. So it was a really good way to like end the series on a high note. Overall thoughts on the series, would not recommend. I did not think it was amazing. Every book either got 2 stars or 3 stars. It was not a very well developed world, but I did like certain things about it. Like, I liked that he wasn't afraid to go dark and go brutal. Like, throughout this whole series, I could never tell like if he was going to kill someone or not. Because it was like he would. Like, he was not afraid of killing major characters in a way that would, like, change the story. And I really liked having those kind of stakes and, like, not knowing where he was going to go next. And I also liked that he allowed his characters to be kids. Like, they're teenagers. They're all, like, I don't know, 17-ish. And he allows them to be young and immature and make, like, stupid decisions. And, like, I do like that. I appreciate that they did act their age. Like, in some ways they have to grow up fast. Like, they're killing people, they're blowing stuff up, they're like on their own in this war. But in other ways they are just like kids, and I really enjoyed that. Things I didn't like, the underdeveloped world, the like way it didn't go anywhere. It was super repetitive. Like, every book, well, apart from the weird kid book and the 4th one where nothing happened, every book was kind of like the same structure. Like, they'd be sitting around in their campsite and be like, hey, like, we should we should probably do something about the war. Like, we should contribute in some way. And they'd talk it out for a while, and then they'd find out a target that they wanted to blow up, and then spend the rest of the book trying to figure out how to make that happen and then making it happen. And then the end of the book would be like them running away. And then that was it, like every book. And I feel like this would have been better if it hadn't been like 7 separate books, because it did just feel like the structure was very repetitive, the actions were very repetitive. If he made it shorter into like 1 or 2 books, he wouldn't have had to make like a different plot for each one, because I felt like that made it weaker. And if he'd spent more time just like developing like singular stories in it and like just condensing the various actions and like expanding within what he had left, it would have been better, because I feel like it just didn't work as 7 separate books. Like, the structure of that wasn't really working for me. But I have read them. They were fine. Wouldn't really recommend them, but like the 7th one was good enough that now I have kind of like positive thoughts about them. Like, it was a great way to end the series, even if, you know, I'm probably never gonna think about them again. And then the last book that I listened to was Momfluenced by Sara Petersen, which is a nonfiction book about momfluencer culture and like Instagram bloggers who are like, you know, make their whole thing about being moms and like all of that. So I gave this 4 stars, but this book was a ride. The first half, I was having a very bad time, like the whole first half of that book. And I almost DNF'd it, because I was just like, this is not for me. Like, the first half wasn't bad. It was just very much about the author and her relationship with motherhood and with momfluencers. And that was kind of the main focus of it. It was like how she feels about motherhood and how she feels about momfluencers and how like those things kind of like collide, and like, you know, her thoughts on all this, and a lot about like kind of what you consider like the generic momfluencer, like, you know, the traditional white Christian beautiful thin woman with her like very cute young toddler kids. Like, that's kind of like the stereotype, and it was a lot about that. So I was having a bad time, and I was like, I have vastly overestimated how much I care about motherhood and this woman's thoughts on motherhood and momfluencers. And then the second half took a turn, and she had this really interesting section on minimalism and what minimalism kind of is, and like how it's kind of been twisted by like millennials in like the early 2000s, and how it became like a different thing with the recession. And like, I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but like, she really went in depth on like what it means for the culture and how the culture has influenced how we see minimalism and like kind of the hypocrisy within some of it. And it was very, very interesting. And that was right about like the middle point of the book, and that was where I realized I was like, oh, like we're actually like taking a turn here, and this is getting really, really interesting. And it was kind of like that for the rest of the book. Like, it wasn't all about minimalism, that was just one section, but that like changed the tide. And she talked a lot about like, I don't know, everything, like sociocultural stuff and like feminism and like classism and racism and like homophobia, and just like how all of these things kind of influence momfluencer culture, and like the ways in which momfluencer culture can be a good thing and like provide communities for people and provide information and like support. And she started talking about like smaller influencers and not like, you know, the stereotypical like whatever. And it became like a very, very interesting book that wasn't just about motherhood, although that was like obviously the main focus, but it discussed a lot of other things, and it, I think, became very valuable and very interesting and very well written. And I would highly recommend it for the second half. Like, the first half, if you are personally interested in those topics, if that sounds interesting to you, just like this woman's relationship with motherhood and momfluencer culture, go for it. But like the second half, I think for everyone else, it was very interesting, very well done, very insightful. So I'm very glad I didn't DNF it, because I almost DNF'd it like right before I hit the minimalism section, which would have been such a waste. I would have missed out a lot, but that was super worthwhile, and I would definitely recommend. The only thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, like a little bit, about this book was that she never talked about the kids. like at all, and I would have expected a book that's all about momfluencer culture to at least address in like sort of an aside the effect it would have on like the kids of momfluencers who are like grow up with this content made about them. And I would have liked, you know, like a chapter to address that, and she kind of didn't at all, which I found kind of odd. Like, again, that wasn't the main focus of the book. I just felt like it should have been addressed, like, as an aside, at least. But overall, it was very interesting, very worthwhile, the second half. So, that was everything that I read in September. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you have. I'm quite happy that I finally finished the Tomorrow series, even if it wasn't amazing. It's been on my list to get to for a long time, and I finally got to it, so that is a success right there. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.